Intamin would enter the next decade with a fantastic slate of new diverse attractions around the world, starting with another coaster for Disney. Themed to the Toy Story movies, RC Racer would open at Walt Disney Studios Park in Paris and would be a Surfrider variant with a unique 20-passenger train themed to the character from the films and theming to the structure to mimic Hot Wheels track. Next would be a return to Alton Towers for another unique secret weapon project. With Intamin always willing to push the boundaries and Alton Towers always having high ambition, a whole new technology was developed for 13. Featuring the family coaster trains, the ride would start out innocent enough up a booster wheel lift and a trip around the dark woods, before hitting another small lift and entering a building. Once inside, riders would come up to a wall, and with seemingly no way out, the whole train would bounce and then drop 16 feet. This would be the first drop track on any coaster, a new dimension of roller coaster design, which would catch riders off guard since it was hidden away in a building out of view. Riders would then be launched backwards and then stop at a transfer track before returning to the station. This special effects coaster would be very impressive for the time and inspire many rides in the future. After two smaller scale coasters, Intamin would reach new heights not attempted for years with their next two coasters, and with this high thrill demand coming, it was time for yet another track innovation. Intamin would upgrade from their 3-pipe track used since Volcano to a new simple round spine that would be able to transfer to a second spine in high-stress moments, as well as the ability of having longer stretches of track without requiring as many supports. The first of these coasters to open would be located at King's Dominion, ironically one of the first parks to debut Intamin's original major innovation. This time it would be for Intamin's second Giga Coaster, but this would be even more of a speed demon than Millennium Force. Intimidator 305 would take its namesake from the greatest NASCAR racer of all time, and would truly live up to that name with a giant steep cable lift and drop, but even more notably, a first-of-its-kind, minimalistic two-support structure to give an eye-catching arch-like appearance. The layout would be very similar to the Megalites, just blown up 3 times, and trading the many airtime hills for low-to-the-ground turns with incredible whip and speed. The massive 9-car train would drop 300 feet directly into a drawn-out low-to-the-ground turn, exerting a ridiculous amount of sustained positive Gs for the common rider, and causing nearly everyone to lose vision until the giant airtime hill that followed. While the ambitious layout would be seen as amazing for coaster fans, many modifications were needed due to the blackout-inducing forces caused by the ride. While I-305 may have been fast, it wouldn't even come close to the next coaster, as Intamin would beat 2 of their own records again, with their own longest and the world's fastest coaster in Formula Rossa at Ferrari World. This coaster would reach the 150 miles per hour mark, and instead of an even taller top hat than King Dakar to break the height record, this layout would fly over 6,800 feet of track to become the 3rd longest coaster in the world, launching riders outside of the indoor park into a layout full of airtime moments and crushing turns. This would also be the first accelerator coaster since Top Thrill Dragster to use a lap bar only restraint in a very unique, bulky Formula 1 themed train. The speeds would be so great that it would require front row riders to wear protective glasses in case of debris causing loss of vision, as the ride sustained its speed incredibly well through the less than 200-foot tall layout. But after reaching higher speeds than would ever be touched for any ride, Intamin decided to retire the accelerator coaster model. After installing 14 in just 9 years around the world, the problematic hydraulic launch would be over, and it would now be the age of the LSM launch. Disney would be pleased with the results of RC in Paris and would start 2011 with another model, this time at the Toy Story Playland being added to Hong Kong Disneyland. Next would be the final Zaxspin coaster to be built, as the model finally found its way to the United States at a park Intamin had built many coasters in the past. To coincide with the release of the DC Comics movie the same year, Green Lantern First Flight would open at Six Flags Magic Mountain with the larger 32-meter layout of Insane. This would unfortunately be one of the most notoriously bad coasters ever due to modifications made by the park, only operating for 6 years and probably contributed greatly to the death of this ride model. The year would have a true highlight though, as Intamin would open their next Blitz coaster, being the first ever triple launch coaster in the world. Cheetah Hunt would open at Busch Gardens Tampa with a more tame layout than the two multi-launches before it, instead focusing on a sprawling family-friendly layout over the park's Animal Serengeti. The coaster also featured a unique wind catcher tower that would provide a figure-8 360-degree view rather than a top hat, as well as one heartline roll and a quick series of turns through a cave over water. "2012 would start off with a bang with another surf rider at Atala Happy Land Park. At first glance, this doesn't look any different from the other surf riders before it, but this would be the only 40-meter version built, twice as tall as any other. This extra height and location on the beach make it surely the best of its kind. Next would be an entirely new model, this time Intamin's take on the popular water coaster. While this market had been nearly solely owned by Mack Rides the last decade, Intamin would, pun intended, make a splash with Divertical at Mirabilandia. This would be over 60 feet taller than any water coaster built before it, and is still the tallest water coaster in the world at 164 feet. The coaster would reach this height up a massive elevator lift, followed by a drop into a few turns and the classic big splashdown at the end. The third coaster of the year would be a whole new experiment for Intamin, and would complete a trilogy of coasters for Hershey Park. The park looked to build a hypercoaster, but had very limited space at the time over a tiny creek. Intamin would use many of the designs from Intimidator 305, including the two-support arch lift and the new double-spine track, but develop an entirely new train to make this a new coaster model. Featuring single-row cars and 4 wide seats, these trains would seat 2 riders in the middle and then 1 rider slightly outside and lower on the train to the left and right. Not only that, this would be Intamin's first coaster to feature a new generation over-the-shoulder lap bar, which would secure riders and allow for even more freedom. The result was possibly the world's most unique hypercoaster in Sky Rush. While nearly every other hypercoaster focuses on large hills with airtime, Sky Rush's largest moment is no more than 100 feet, and instead uses its layout to focus on low-to-the-ground elements, with crushing positive and lateral G-forces and thigh-breaking negative G-forces. The coaster would fly out of the station with the world's fastest cable lift, getting riders to 200 feet in seconds, so fast in fact that it needed to be slowed down after its opening year. This was yet another coaster from Intamin whose park and audience may see the ride as too intense, and thus began a long period where Intamin was no longer looked towards to build large thrill rides in the United States. After over a decade with great relationships with Six Flags, Cedar Fair, and Hershey Park, Sky Rush, along with other non-roller coaster ride failures, nearly blacklisted Intamin out of the public eye of many Americans. But this would not be the end, as it was now the time for more international coasters and more new models to win back the trust of the many US chains. This new international period would begin in Turkey with another new generation family coaster with Maceraperist at Vialand. This would be another intense family coaster, featuring 2 large hills, fast helixes, and turns. 2 coasters would be built in China, starting with an updated 10 inversion model in Crazy Coaster at Lokajoy Holiday Theme Park. This would now feature a cable lift into a new diving drop rather than the pre-drop on the previous version, as well as updated track, profiling, and lap bar only restraints on the accelerator-style chassis. The second would be a new take on the wing coaster trains of Furious Baco, as well as the half-pipe layout of the Surf Riders. This ride, named U-shaped roller coaster, would sadly only operate for 1 year at Victory Kingdom and has been standing but not operating ever since. This would seat riders back to back facing each other with the Skyrush over-the-shoulder lap bars, launching up and down large 187-foot spikes, and would be the only model of this coaster ever built. The last coaster of the year would be the second updated motorbike coaster with Juvelin at Jers Summerland. This would seat riders on small ATVs on the search for a jewel and would be far more intense than the previous 2 motorbike coasters attempted. This would launch to 52 miles per hour and feature many fast low-to-the-ground turns, as well as a large hill. Intamin would make a small return to the United States next year, with a roller coaster that was more of a dark ride, but had a few prominent coaster sections. Working on their first coaster for Universal, this would be the headline attraction in the highly anticipated expansion of their very popular Wizarding World section of Diagon Alley. Harry Potter and the Escape from Gringotts would open to massive crowds at Universal Studios Florida and would feature large minecart ride vehicles that were able to spin throughout, giving an extra dimension to not only the coaster, but the dark ride scenes as well. The ride would begin with a tilt track, followed by a drop and a few show scenes, before a launch through a screen and some more spinning after. Not the only highly themed coaster to open, Darkmare would open at Cinecittà World as the second multi-dimension coaster, featuring a large lift and screen effects, followed by a drop track and a small launch. Cinecittà World would also install another second-generation 10 inversion with Altair CCW0204. The last coaster of the year would be the second in a row for Vialand with Nefeskessen. This coaster was an example of a ride that surely would have been an accelerator model just a few years before, but now LSMs had no problem launching a train to 68 miles per hour over a large top hat. The coaster would then charge over a massive airtime hill, a dive loop, a Stengel dive, and a wonky inline twist to end the ride, and featured the new lap bar only trains from the updated 10 inversion coasters. "2015 would see another 2 coasters come to Turkey, this time at Korsan Adası, starting with the last Ulven-style layout in Family Coaster. The second would be a clone of iSpeed in Redfire, this time just featuring the lap bar only trains of the updated 10 inversions and Nefeskessen. Next would be a second water coaster in Hydro Racer at Zishuangbana Sunakland. This version would be scaled back from Divertical, with a shorter flume section, overall height, and less turns at the end, but in a nicer tropical location. The final coaster of the year would be located fully indoors at China's Roman U Park, known as Euro Express. This strange coaster would feature a cable lift along the wall of the building, and then drop into a near-exact mirrored layout of Canonen. This would also be the only Intamin Blitz-style ride to feature a 2-car train, featured lap bars, and would travel through many well-themed European landmarks. After a few slower years, 2016, Intamin would come back in full force with 5 massive coasters. The first of these would be Typhoon Coaster at Land of Legends theme park in Turkey. This would easily be the best themed of the water coasters, featuring a small indoor show section before the vertical lift, and then a similar layout to Hydro Racer into a beautiful blue pool at the end. The Wing Hypercoaster would make its second and final appearance with Flying Aces at Ferrari World, featuring a taller and larger layout than Skyrush. The ride also featured Intamin's first non-inverting loop, which would twist riders upright at the apex of the loop and then twist back down, an even faster lift than Skyrush, and a heartline roll at the end. 2 coasters opened in China, the first of which being Coaster Through the Clouds at Nanchang Sunac Land. This would be the first traditional style mega coaster in over 10 years since Thunder Dolphin, and would take riders up a massive 242-foot lift and down a 256-foot drop, with many fast turns and strong airtime hills. This would be the only mega coaster to use the accelerator-style chassis with the new style lap bars, and may feature Intamin's first attempt of an outer banked airtime hill towards the end. The second would be a new concept of a launch coaster known as Soaring with Dragon at Hefei Sunac Land. This coaster would feature a brand new train design with a much more open setup with no step in, and an updated version of the Skyrush over-the-shoulder lap bar with a more condensed shape and metal bars to hold. Riders would also sit slightly elevated so their feet would not touch the ground, giving that same freeing feeling of the Wing Hyper. The ride would begin by pulling out of the station onto a transfer track, where the train would stop and then launch forwards, but not making it up the element and rolling back. The train would then launch backwards up a massive vertical spike, Intamin's first on a non-shuttle coaster, and then launch forwards 77 miles per hour up a massive non-inverting loop. The ride would then drop into a gigantic inverted top hat before rocketing over airtime hills and twists and turns around a large dragon statue. This layout with a spike and multi-pass launch would turn the heads of many parks and pushed Intamin to find a way to improve the layout to be even more thrilling. The final coaster of the year would put Intamin back into the public conversation of the world, as the immaculately themed Phantasialand in Germany would contact Intamin to build one of the most eye-catching coasters ever. Taking place in the fantasy village of Klugheim, Terran would use the new generation trains of Soaring with Dragon to take riders through an unreal landscape of rockwork and buildings never seen on such a scale before. While the Blitz coaster would have no inversions, it would launch riders twice over endless crossovers in a layout that would be impossible to memorize. The coaster featured many small hills and turns that were beginning to become popular at the time, and proved to the world that nobody could still build a thrill coaster as dynamic as Intamin. The next year would be another huge one, with 6 new coasters opening, all being different models. The smallest would be the third Intamin at Ferrari World, Turbo Track. This would not be the massive coasters of Formula Rossa and Flying Aces, instead just a small shuttle coaster. 12 riders would be seated on a single-car train, with the middle riders facing each other, and launch over a small hill, up a twisted spike through the roof, and then back. While the ride as a whole may be somewhat underwhelming, it would be the first coaster to feature an LSM launch on non-straight track, which would prove to be very useful for not just Intamin, but other manufacturers in the future. Next would be the final megalite to be built, with Lightspeed at Visionland, which strangely has no footage online, as well as another 10 inversion coaster with Wielkołowski Miasto Kombinat 2 at Wonder Island. There would also be another straddle coaster, this time back in the United States, with Wavebreaker the Rescue Coaster at SeaWorld San Antonio. This would be themed to jet skis and have a new large lap bar, and take riders above water and on an island with 2 tire launches. This year would also see the return of the inverted coaster, as Intamin had not built one for nearly 15 years, but this time as a new model for families. Drow Kong would be the 3rd Intamin at Jers Summerland and feature a new 7-row train with the same seat and lap bar developed for the new multi-launch coasters. This coaster would feature a small tire launch out of the station through a small indoor section and then up a lift where families would be plunged into a strong layout featuring many fast turns and small drops. The biggest coaster of the year would be the new tallest and fastest coaster in Europe at Spain's new Ferrari Land Park. Red Force would be a return to the large top hat style coaster for Intamin, but now as an LSM launch instead of hydraulic. Riders would be seated in a 3-car new generation train and roll out of the station into a 112-mile-per-hour launch over a 367-foot top hat and down a straight drop before a small hop into the brakes. This is still the fastest and tallest any Intamin LSM launch coaster has gone, and many wonder if it is the limit of the technology compared to the more unreliable hydraulics. "2018 would see even more coasters open than the year before, beginning with their last coaster for Disney, Rex's Racer. This would be a 3rd RC layout and be in addition to the new Shanghai Disneyland. There would also be 2 more straddle coasters, both being themed to ATVs. Yukon Quad at Le Pal would be a clone of Juvelin, and Paradise Fall at Asia Park may have the most tame layout of any family launch built yet, with a launch into a wave stall and then a very slow layout around some turns. There would also be a 2nd family inverted coaster with Fast and Furious at the indoor Warner Bros. Movie World Abu Dhabi. This would be themed to the Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner shorts from the Looney Tunes and take riders through quick show scenes in the famous rock canyons from the cartoons. There would also be another multi-launch coaster at Shanghai Haicheng Ocean Park with Steel Dolphin. This would feature a small dip into a launch, followed by a top hat and some hills before Intamin's first true outward banked element. This would be a hill that would bank riders the opposite way of what would traditionally be the correct path, popularized over the last few years by new manufacturer Rocky Mountain Construction. There would also be a 2nd launch, many quick, highly banked turns, strong airtime hills, and a dive into a shark's mouth. But a new park in Poland was about to flesh out its growing lineup even further, with 2 large coasters named Energylandia. The first would be Speed, a water coaster and a near clone of Divertical, and the second would be a new generation mega coaster named Hyperion. This would be an evolution of the wing hypers attempted before, with a similar seating arrangement but a floor under the winged seats, as well as the modern lap bar from the new multi-launch coasters. This would also be the first mega coaster to abandon the cable lift, which had become the standard on all versions since Millennium Force, for a chain lift that would take riders up the giant 252-foot lift. The cable lift would now only be used on the Tenon version coasters and may be discontinued entirely at this point. Riders would plunge down the 269-foot drop, the tallest on any hypercoaster, over a massive hill and then through a dive loop turnaround. The coaster would then rocket through a low-to-the-ground wave turn and then over more straight and twisted hills before a water splash at the end. "2019 would see another 2 Turkish Intamins be built, but these 2 would not see the great success of the other rides in the country. Anka Park, also known as Wonderland Eurasia, would plan to open a staggering 17 coasters in 2019. While these would come from a wide variety of different manufacturers, the two Intamin coasters would be a tenon version known as Lightspeed and a Jet Rescue clone known as Chanavar Dalga. While Lightspeed did open to guests, it would not be for long, as government issues caused the park to close just months after opening and all of its coasters to be standing but not operating since. Another project that faced many construction problems finally opened their new coaster as well, with Timmy's Half-Pipe Havoc finally opening at Nickelodeon Universe in the long-delayed American Dream Mall. This would be a surf rider themed to the Fairly Odd Parents cartoon show, but be the first to feature a new lap bar only restraint for a more comfortable ride. The next coaster would be the very strange indoor coaster Kereta Misteri at Dunia Fantasi in Indonesia. The ride would feature a very slow indoor dark section themed to wolves before suddenly launching up a tire-propelled lift into a show scene with a large, terrifying wolf figure. The train would then take a backwards dip and wait for another switch track before dropping into another coaster section of drops and turns. After a few strange coasters, the last 3 of the year would all be world-class, starting with the multi-launch Tega at Leninmaki. The coaster would launch into an outward banked 0G winder, some small snappy twists before hitting the second launch into a top hat and a first-of-its-kind element for Intamin, a large stalling dive loop. Intamin had dabbled into extended stalling inversions in the past, such as on Soaring with Dragon, but this was the first slow sustained inversion, as an attempt to mimic the sensations seen on many of the coasters from rival Rocky Mountain construction. The coaster would then travel a speed hill, followed by a large Immelman, more negative and positive G turns, before whipping through a quick barrel roll finale, similar to the inversion on Ice Speed. This new generation of Intamin elements were definitely starting to show their inspiration from other manufacturers and industry trends, but their next coaster reminded everyone that nobody could still do it like they do. This would be the magnificent Dueling Dragons at Guangzhou Sunakland, a massive multi-launch dueling coaster, with one side being a standard sit-down train and the other being an inverted coaster, with a similar configuration to the family inverted model. This had been attempted once before with Vekoma's Battlestar Galactica at Universal Studios Singapore, but was ultimately a failure due to the improperly weighted trains and different ride styles. Dueling Dragons would be a much more thrilling experience, and would also be Intamin's first double coaster in over 20 years, since all the way back to Lethal Weapon Pursuit. The experience would begin with both coasters pulling onto a switch track, similar to Soaring with Dragon, with the red sit-down train on top of the green inverted train, before launching together halfway up a vertical loop. They would both then roll back and launch up a vertical spike before launching together to complete the loop. The green and red sides would then do their own unique layouts, featuring many quick inversions and airtime moments, while meeting up with each other multiple times for one-of-a-kind incredible flyby elements. But speaking of Dueling Dragons, in 2017, Universal's Islands of Adventure would close their incredible dueling Bolliger and Mabillard coaster of the same name, and its replacement would come this year from Intamin. Made to fit better into the now Wizarding World land, the original concept of the replacement did not seem to please many of the thrill seekers who believed the B&M Invert was a more thrilling ride, but when Hagrid's Magical Creatures Motorbike Adventure opened, the critics would quickly be silenced. First of all, the coaster would feature one-of-a-kind trains, with one seat of the car being a motorbike, similar to Juvelin or others opened before, and the other being a lower-sitting, more standard sidecar. The trains would then travel into the forest and experience show scenes and animatronics through an unprecedented 7 launches throughout the ride. The previous record was 4, held by Mauer's Fiorano GT Challenge at Ferrari World, so that alone would be enough to impress, but Intamin was not done. Riders would be launched forwards up a vertical spike and travel through the world's first high-speed switch track. This device would perform a track switch while the ride was still in motion, so the coaster would not have to stop and wait for the track to transfer before going backwards. This would thrill riders who could not anticipate the switch coming, as riders were then launched backwards into another effect. The trains would continue to back up into a show building into one of 2 drop track shafts, dropping 17 feet and pulling into another launch and some final turns before ending the ride. The number of special track elements, non-stop nature of the ride, multiple thematic elements, and ability to run a staggering 10 trains through the chaotic layout made Hagrid a worldwide phenomenon and completely changed the trajectory of Universal's attractions going forward. It would also be no surprise that all these elements ran up the price tag to a staggering $300 million, making it the most expensive coaster ever built. This would begin an incredible relationship between Universal and Intamin, as Universal had the money and ambition, and Intamin believed they had the technology and engineering to achieve the impossible.